Hello, this will be part 11 now throughout of the series An Ancient Legacy, and I'm looking at how ancient sites across the world incorporating the same features such as archaeoastronomy in terms of equinox, solstice alignments, creating shadows on very special days such as the equinox, but also more importantly how the measurements are connected, because that people would be using astronomy uh, uh, that's not too much, well, of course, in a way. However, uh, by examining the systems of measurement and proportions, that these consistently come back to the same measurements, the same numbers, is, I think, a very strong case to be made. Firstly, that global trade and exchange of goods as well as knowledge goes back much further than what the official history would recognize, because coincidence cannot explain this. It's bordering on a pathology to try and explain it in that way. But for instance, for Mayans and the Olmecs, I've had a look at now in Japan. I've briefly touched on that. I will come back to that as well. Well, across Asia, from East Asia through India to the Indus civilization, to the Sumerian civilization, to the Great Pyramids, and again, in future I'll go into some of the other temple complexes as well in Egypt, because these are incorporating the same systems of measurement. And as an example, the famous and not so famous stone circles, henges, and dolmens, tumulus mounds that are in the England, Ireland, and Scotland. Now, the last one was stone ships, and again, touching on that, there are other stone ships, and I'll go into those because, trust me, the measurements. Again, we're working on units of measurement and how they all connect, and it's part of an ancient legacy that was transferred through the Greco-Roman period, and is still with us today, like literally with us today in our systems of weights and measures, our symbols, the US dollar bill, the dollar coins, like quite literally the weight of the coins is part of this ancient legacy going back to Old Kingdom, Egypt, and Sumer. It's a traceable, unbroken legacy, just because it goes against the official history. Well, again, I won't go into a rant on that. Now, I already mentioned Ailstones, stone ship, which has this connection to Stonehenge, and of course, Stonehenge being the most famous one, but there are so many other stone circles, wood circles, henges that incorporate this same feature. Newgrange in Ireland, I'll be touching on that towards the end of this presentation. And earlier we already looked at up around the Brodgar area, so the Ring of Brodgar, Stoneness Circle, and Saltno, and also Structure 10 in Brodgar and some other places as well I've mentioned in this. It's exactly the same systems of measurement, just continued through still to this day, very important in. Now, when I haven't marked out, I have mentioned, but I haven't marked out, is also Maeshowe, just short distance from the Stenessone circles, which is of course a short distance from the Ring of Brodgar. Recent studies have all but confirmed that these are astronomically aligned above 99.99%, and that it occurs across this part of the world and every other part of the world. It clearly shows that it's there. The people were very much engaged in astronomy, and very sophisticated astronomy as well, more than what the obvious features are. Now, one of the excuses used to say is that, well, they were making these stone circles so they knew when to plant crops and stuff like that. That's just silly, because you don't need that knowledge to plant crops. Like my parents grew up on a farm, they understood how to do these things, and they didn't need a stone circle or a calendar to do it. What's happening here is that these megalithic structures are much more important than that. There's much more reason and to all of these things. But okay, Maeshowe aligned to the winter solstice. Now, Newgrange in Ireland, again, so we have these just in the England, Ireland, Scotland. We see these things. Now, Newgrange also is part of a wider complex. So we have Noath not too far away, which also has these very same things going on, but Newgrange also aligned to the winter solstice as well. So if you can't see, look, there's the doorway. We get a rough idea of the angle there. And if we go back to Maeshowe, you see how now that's going there. Now some of them are to the sunset, some of them to the sunrise. Now also not very famous, but still just as important, we have in southern Spain a couple of, well, there's lots of sites there, but two that I've mentioned because of the importance of their measurements. And again, I'll go into it more, doing more connections because but we have the Menga dolmen and the Viera dolmen. They're arranged to the summer solstice. So what we have is a little bit further up in, so there we are in the Menga and Viera dolmen. They're only about 200 and 300 feet away from one another. And then we have a winter solstice arrangement. Now I want to go to Carnac in France, which is relatively well known, but I want to have a look at some other sites. Now throughout the series, earlier videos, I have been mentioning such as Kercado, dolmen there, which is almost aligned to the, there we see it here, almost aligned to the, actually I think it might be hidden in the woods there, but that's where the site is there, almost aligned to winter solstice. However, there's been some, like a grave and some other artifacts there which go back 4,500 BC, meaning this site could possibly be 6,500 years old. So the almost alignment could also possibly be explained by the precession of the equinoxes and the movement of the, well, again, this 25,920 year cycle, which is so important in regards to these sites because the measurements, the symbology contains this very advanced knowledge of long-term astronomical cycles. Now, this whole region, and there I've only marked off a few here and I'll get to more, but what we have in the Carnac region, we have some lot of stone alignments. And okay, so that was Maeshowe. I mentioned that I have Newgrange in Ireland. This is the Kercado dolmen, which the measurements, again, it's been a recurring theme, how it connects to so many other sites in West Kennet, Longbarrow, Seahenge, Stony Littleton, Longbarrow, all these places across, especially in England. Okay, this is the Grand Fallen Menhir. Now that's 98 feet long. This is 98 feet wide. Again, that's one of these just standards that just keeps coming up. So that's the Fallen Menhir. This whole area around Carnac's very important. Lots of alignments. Now, even this is an interesting feature. But here we see the fallen, the broken menhir. There's another tumulus there, and another site that I'll be mentioning, especially at the end, because I'll be connecting it to, so Newgrange, Maeshowe, these mounds with a passage that's aligned to the solstice. And I'll also be coming back, this is Gavrinis in France. Now, so that's Gavrinis. And so there we see where Gavrinis is in relation to Kercado, the fallen menhir. Now, there's a whole bunch of other alignments. We'll go into those in other episodes. I've mentioned that, again, the measurements connects very strongly. So here we see there, and the aligned to the solstice as well. And but it's more than that. But now another interesting feature is just a little swim across the water to Lannic. And what we have here is a very interesting site because you have this, not a stone circle, it's a stone rectangle. That's that these things here, especially are not around Carnac, don't build in stone circles. They build in alignments or in rectangles. We're going to focus on one of these particular rectangles in this episode, and I'm going to go into some other ones. expanding on existing research, because there's some lovely maths in here that connects again to all these other apparently separate cultures spread across time and still built into very important modern esoteric organizations. They're major buildings, cathedrals, public buildings. Yeah, it's all it's just repeated. Now, as an example of, so that's Gavrinis. Just over the water we have Lannic, and there you can get a idea. Now, again, this is, how old is this that it's been sunk? Now, there could have been some shifting, some tectonic, there are some, but possibly again, this might be so old that it, yeah, again, yeah, that's a bit of uncertainty there. So we'll just leave that to the side now. Okay, before we move on, now the feature of this particular episode will be, so where we see Gavrinis and Lannic, the fallen menhir, the Kercado. There is also the Menhir alignments, a few other major stone alignments, over 1,000 stones over quite some distance as well. Alexander Thom and others have investigated these, but this feature will be on the Crucuno. I hope I get that. Crucuno, Quadrilateral, and again we have a rectangle stone alignment rather than the stone circles that we would see in across the world, but especially in Scotland and England. However, they do incorporate the same things. Now, pardon, in Avebury they've recently discovered a stone rectangle as well. So it appears that there is some crossover, and that these, in Avebury, the measures actually match this as well. And we'll look at some other more connections, but this will be the feature of this particular episode. Okay, so here we see the quadrilateral as shown from Google Earth, and as with all these structures, it contains some very important information. Now, to begin with, this is one of many sites that were surveyed by Alexander Thom, and as well as with his son, in conjunction with some work he did with some other people. I'll link an article in the, a paper in the description. So we have astronomical significance of the Crucuno stone rectangle, and it's talking about the measurements used, 3, 4, 5 triangles, its position north of the equator, and how that connects. And there's some excellent information, and I'll put that link, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So megalithic yards, Alexander Thom, one of these pioneers, especially because it's my favourite topic in regards to looking into ancient history. Is any civilization, any society is dependent on standard of weights and measures. It still is now the basis of trade. It's still a basis of law. Did a couple series in regards to magic wands, as they're called. They're actually measuring rods, such as Kundalini, or the Caduceus held by Hermes, Thoth, Nuar and Fuzi, countless other gods, creator gods, gods of science, crossing cultures, again crossing time, and still such an important symbol resonating with us to this day. But as always, what we have is some very beautiful basic geometry which emerges from the Vesica Pisces. This is like the first step in understanding, the first step onto understanding some very complex maths and geometry comes from this. It's a circle with the center of the first circle on the edge of the second. Why is it called the Vesica Pisces, Vesica Piscis? It's called the vessel of the fish, or the bladder of the fish, which is another way of saying the container of the fish. And that's it. Now, I'll put a link in the description to the Vesica Geometric Origins of Christian Symbols, because even in other cultures you'll find this, the symbol and the basic math connected to this is just so vital. And for instance, it's a standard in cathedral and Christianity again, but crosses cultures, and it's going back, and it extends back much further, because the cross is actually a much older symbol, but that's I'll touch on that. The link will be in the description. So if we overlay that, the vesica over the top here, we can see how it creates, the vesica portion is defining it. Now that's the square root of 3 and some other lovely square root of 5 if you extend it out to the edge of a rectangle. This covered in other videos, especially Freemasons such as Governor Lachlan Macquarie here in Australia, who basically set out the basic street plans, street widths here in Australia, was working with the vesica or vesica proportions. At least it's so important. It's written into the symbolism. People such as Randall Carlson and these other researchers have talk about it so often, how important it is and how it has geometric, mathematical, but also astronomical connections. And earlier episode I talked about the synodic month. Well, it's all bound up in there, the full moons and eclipses. And so there we see the basic rectangle. Just lined it out just to help give a version. I should have twisted it a little bit. It slightly should be angled a touch over to that, and that's an important, that it's not strictly speaking running perfectly north-south. That's another now. But what we have here is it's creating a 3, 4, 5 triangle across the diameter. And so, and of course, well, Egyptian rope stretchers. So the 3, 4, 5 triangle goes back to very old period of Egypt. They used it to create a right angle triangle. So for instance, when the Nile flooded and people lost a certain piece of their land to the flood, the tax rate would be adjusted for that purpose. And this was one of the reasons why rope stretchers. Now, even really old depictions about the earliest temples show the pharaoh stretching a rope and marking with a stake in the ground the sacred precinct from which the temple would be defined. You can find this in ancient India, where they would do very similar, but for instance lay a stake to watch the shadow, and then from the shadow would give the alignment to where the temple should be built. So these very basic principles, by using a couple of sticks, a piece of rope, is, if you understand it and if you start using logic and deduction, and then through observation of astronomical events as well as some basic maths, you can really start, a civilization can really start to become quite scientific. And that's one of the reasons why this is so important. Pythagorean theorem, it's a friggin' awesome bit of knowledge that is usually credited to, say, we say 3, 4, 5. I just tie the knots, count out the knots, and there you have a 3, 4, 5 triangle. Goes back to ancient Egypt. It's also present in the Great Pyramid. Now, they were known to use this triangle. That's not in dispute. Though it will be disputed whether they understood Pythagorean theorem, which I think is, it's protecting the narrative in a way that. But anyway, but it's in the Great Pyramid itself, in the upper chamber, or the King's Chamber, which contains so much lovely metrology, like the knowledge of measures and how it's done in these proportions. It's really, really cool. We've got shafts running off, aligning to stars, and yet somehow they're able to build this massive, probably still is the world's greatest piece of construction, and that they weren't able to understand Pythagorean theorem. Well, it's just silly. But the upper chamber itself, I'll link this video in the description. It's full of astronomical. The construction is just awesome technique and accuracy. It even includes a delium problem. Seems to have been solved by the sarcophagus, but the structure itself is at a 3, 4, 5. Creates a 3, 4, 5 triangle, and I'll explain that why I go down to that corner there, because there's a narrow trench running around the outside, and so what in between the bottom of the flooring and the roof, they're just like the pyramid itself. They're doubling up its inside and what's outside. For instance, the Great Pyramid is built on a paving stone. That layer of paving stones is essential in understanding its relationship into the size of the Earth, just like the sockets are. It's 86,400 to 1, not 43,200. Covered that earlier, but eventually it's going to have to catch on, because it's just so much filled with so much more knowledge, so much more elegant, but I digress. So Pythagorean theorem, here's obviously it's not from the Pythagorean era that this was painted, but we do see, well, music, we'll come back to that. We also see the 3, 4, 5 triangle there being so important. Pythagoras, his contemporaries and those who come before him were learning from the ancient Indians and the ancient Egyptians as well. They, just because we have surviving records from that period, we give it to the Pythagorean theorem, to Pythagoras, but there's so much literal evidence that it was understood well before, but we just don't have a nice ISBN number, peer-reviewed journal from those periods, and that's sad, because we can, the evidence is there and the only defense against it is to call it coincidence, which is the war cry of the fool. Euclid's 47th, Euclid's Elements, the world's basically oldest, most important textbook, been printed. Every culture, every religion, whether it's Hindus, Islam, Christian, Jews, Euclid is a vital piece of book. But Euclid's 47th proposition, which is the 3, 4, 5 triangle, is also a very important part in still to this day, for instance, Freemasonry, which goes back to the craft guilds and the construction guilds, going back to the great cathedrals, and they, of course, were part of a long tradition extending back in time, back through to the Roman period, back to the Greek period, which of course then goes back to Babylon, Persia, and Egypt, and the ancient Indian civilizations. Even ancient Chinese worked this out. And again, it's so important. It's just like the Vesica. It's one of the fundamental points of understanding, and from the Pythagorean theorem you can then deduce and do so many other calculations. It's just awesome importance. Hermeticists, of course, I did a series on understand how these tracing boards are basically astronomical, alchemical, mathematical textbooks written in a symbolic way. And so we see the 3, 4, 5 triangle, 1, 2, 3, 4 being the Tetractys. We'll come back to that. Even the 5/6 pattern, and it's just written. This is not superstitious gobbledygook. This is some very profound, very key information in understanding modern maths and geometry and the evolution of it. However, we just got this modern mindset that Anyway, it's a sickness. But also, so the 3, 4, 5 triangle, Pythagorean theorem. What else is this quadrilateral encoding? Again, going back to the Vesica, which is at a 2:3 ratio, and of course this would create a 4:3 ratio. That's why we get the 3, 4, 5 triangle. Now we have a look at the Tetractys. I just showed that 1, 2, 3, 4 earlier. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and now we come to the Tetractys. We see 1, 2, 3, 4. There we get a better, just a clearer picture, and that also connects to the tetragrammaton, which is so important still in esoteric, hermetic tradition. Of course, for the Bible and for Kabbalah and still for Judaism, they use it as the name of God. But this in itself contains some important information, so musical information. So the Pythagorean hammers, how Pythagorean music theory developed, or at least was said to have developed. It's actually, again, it exists in older times, but it's just just because it's there. The musical theory, it's built into the temples of ancient India and elsewhere, and it's a very important piece of information. And the Pythagorean hammers is 2:3, 4:3 ratio, 4:3, 2:3, of course coming from the Tetractys, giving us the perfect fourth and the fifth, so important. Still now in music theory, 4:3, 4:3, 2:3, 2:3, or 3:2. And I'll put the link in the description where I explain this a little bit better, the Pythagorean hammers, music of the spheres, and how it even connects to astronomical, the solar system and the distance of the planets through Bode's law, which is something very lovely, very basic geometry, very basic maths, explaining some very complex astronomy. And again, the establishment doesn't like it because, well, it doesn't suit their vision of having, you know, some random number with a long string of decimals, then it's sciencey. But if you have some very simple, very geometrical explanation of it, then somehow it's somehow superstitious or whatever, and they don't like it. They prefer to do this specialized in-house thinking where only they can understand the method, and if you try and teach a simpler method, it's somehow you're out there. Again, it's just an illness. Link will be in the description to this as well. Nice picture when I'm from Google Earth. This was uploaded by Visio Marcus, and I think it's very nice and telling because we have the harp inside the quadrilateral there. I'll put the link in the description. Donald Duck and Mathemagic Land. Excellent cartoon explaining this. It's, again, highly recommended if you haven't seen it, because these Pythagorean knowledge of math and geometry, how it contains to music, and then also, of course, astronomy is just, again, something that's really lovely. Some really beautiful simple methods that are geometrically, mathematically, you can show them. They're not really in dispute. It's just that because it links somehow again to some sort of superstitious or esoteric, anything that's esoteric is either called, again, like some superstitious thing, or you have this other branch of people who call it demonic and all this other stuff. They just don't understand the maths, they don't understand the geometry, they don't understand the astronomy. It's actually quite you know, lest judge not lest you be judged, you know, and if let no one ignorant of geometry enter my home, you know? Okay, constant repeated theme throughout this whole series, other videos, has been the Salamis stone and how this ancient measure conversion tool incorporates, for instance, a Doric and Ionic, as in the Doric and Ionic column. Forms of architecture also important in Freemasonry, as well as the common or the English foot going back 2,500 years ago. It's much older than what the standard history would say. It's testable, it's tangible, we have physical evidence of it. Yet it's so important to protect the existing narrative on these histories. It's, again, it's unexplainable. So the Salamis stone, these particular units, how they connect to other units, I'll do some follow-ups. I did some individual videos later in this series. I want to try to bring all this together to show how the proportions and the measurements are actually part of a older coherent system. So the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian, and the common foot, as well as the Cremona or Corinthian, how they relate to, well, of course, the meter, the pendulum, and the Egyptian royal cubit, as well as the megalithic, because what we see throughout these structures is a harmony between multiple sets of units of measures at very harmonious, very, let's call it Pythagorean places, but of course it's much older than Pythagoras. The Salamis stone, so if I do, there's a tracing. Mark Wilson Jones was the first person to decode this, but also, I mean, compare it using it and examining further, but it also gives you this 2:3 ratio for itself, which of course connects to so many important ancient temples, ancient Egypt, India, Greco-Roman period, and of course here in Western Europe. I'll put the link in the description, because even Vitruvian Man, very famous, well, it's actually based on, well, it just coincidentally fits this pattern so well. It's Leonardo drew Vitruvian Man after the architect, 1st century architect Vitruvius, who studied these things and these proportions in older Greek temples and then made sure that they were incorporated into Roman architecture as well. Of course, the link will be in the description. Now back to Alexander Thom and my favourite subject, and measuring. And mentioned the article paper earlier. I'll put the link in the description where he goes through these. A lot of information in there, too much for the moment, but he points out this triangle, quadrilateral, is 40 by 30 megalithic yards. Now the unit he defined as the megalithic yard was 2.722 feet, very close to the other lovely number. I'm proposing that the exact figure should be 2.722222 feet. Now that's less than the width of a hair, but it's important because using that, if you use this one, it actually brings us to a beautiful harmony, perfect point where the measures of the Salamis stone come together with the megalithic yard, which is so important in connecting it to other ancient units of measure. And so, again, by a fraction of a hair, what we have is, well, actually a unity point. Now, using the megalithic scale, what we get is 81.666 or 2/3 feet and 108.888 feet. At this point, it's worth mentioning Flinders Petrie. Well, so Matthew Flinders Petrie, basically the father of modern architecture, he did the first rigid surveying of Stonehenge as well as the Great Pyramid and other places, of course, across Egypt. He was like the first person to survey them with some really, really rigid measurements, unlike some earlier ones. Now, that's one of the things that about this is, well, so whether it's a rectangle or a circle, how do you measure it? Do you measure it from the inside of the stone, from the center point, or from the outside of the stone? Earlier videos I mentioned how, for instance, Stonehenge and all these other stone circles are 108 feet, but if you measure from the inside of a stone, you get a slightly lesser one, which brings us to 29.53, the synodic month, all this information. But of course, 108 is important as well. And so I would, using that method, I would put forth that, well, it's all, apart from being 40 megalithic and 30 megalithic yards, it's also 182 feet, depending whether you measure it from inside, middle, or outside of the stone. Now, for instance, just a stone's throw away, I mentioned Kercado earlier. So there we have the quadrilateral, and we have the Kercado dolmen. Now, that's interesting because it's 98 by 82 feet. So, okay, we have the 82 feet here as well. Also worth mentioning, again, I've sort of touched on it in earlier videos, we have the grand fallen menhir at which is 98, was 98 feet long when standing, and I'll connect these to some other important features as well. But at this point, 82 feet. Why am I saying it's 82 feet? Again, mentioned it in earlier videos, but we see in ancient sites across the world, some very, very old ones still to this day, 82 feet as a just reappearing over and over and over again. Now, even structure 10 at Ness of Brodgar, 82 by 65 feet. Now, this will be interesting because we have it in just, it's everywhere. Including the step pyramid at Saqqara, but Maeshowe 82 by 65 feet, just like structure 10 at Brodgar, which is just, again, a stone's throw away. The Menga dolmen I mentioned earlier in Spain, and Persepolis, just, everywhere, all the time. Now, to call it a coincidence or meaningless, I think it's, well, not doing justice to the connections. But also, say, the step pyramid, the shaft of 82 feet as well, Ain Dara, Ishtar Gate, West Kennet Long Barrow, and, again, many, many others. But if we go back, so that's one reason why I think it's 82 feet would be incorporated. Now, at why 108 feet? Well, again, the previous videos I went into detail. 108 feet in the Mayan, ancient India, it's in Japan, it's all over the place. I'm going to put a link in the description to a video. Now, 82 feet is 27.3. I'll go into that in a moment. But why is 108 important? Well, here you go. This is one of the reasons why it's so important. But I'll put the link in the description to a video where I go into 108, how it's just a standard cross-time, cross-culture, still in use today, very important, but also in part of an ancient tradition which is being passed on. And why is 27 now? Earlier in this series I mentioned 27.3, why it's so important. Well, again, it's this very important astronomical number, and I'll put a link to the description there because to this video where I sort of go and look at Paris and how 108 and 273 are interrelated with one another. It's very important, very profound astronomical knowledge, measurable, and again, measurable with some very simple tools. You don't need a a Hubble telescope up there in space to do it. You can do it with some very basic tools such as a cross staff, a quadrant, and some basic counting, a pendulum as well. So that will be also linked in there. Now, also Alexander Thom mentions in his paper about the position of this quadrilateral, this stone quadrilateral here in Carnac, and how it's, well, calculating where is the best place for measuring the sun rising at the solstices. Well, using this, it would be at 47 degrees and 31 minutes, and the latitude here is 47 degrees and 37.5 minutes. So like a very, very close. Now, if you'd incorporate the length of time, precession, and all these other things, I would it's probably some more lovely info in there to be extracted. But that's important because stone circle. So this is a Keswick circles, a castle rig. Stone circle, you could use Stonehenge, Hurler, Triplet stones, any one of these stone circles. Of course, temples all over the world are arranged in this way, ancient temples. Now, Newgrange in Ireland, aligned to the winter solstice, passes down the passage. Mentioned Maeshowe, well, that has the same feature there, sometimes in the morning, sometimes at sunset. But also Gavrinis is also aligned to the winter solstice. And, well, where is Gavrinis? There we see the quadrilateral, there we see Kercado, and there we have a Gavrinis tumulus. See it there. And that's also, as I mentioned earlier, Lannic, the partially now sunken stone rectangle, and I'll go into that because that has, you basically could take the measurements here and drop them into the Mayan Olmec temples, or really anywhere, but again, it just matches again. It's, you know, it's measurable. It's like right there in your face, and it's just showing that there is this ancient, very profound, very important tradition which extends, you know, back in time, across cultures, across the world. And standard weights and measures would be so important. This, it indicates that there was an exchange of information. Because why the same measurements consistently? Well, that it can't be coincidence. Now, another thing would say that the people of Ireland, such here as at Newgrange, weren't really in exchange with the people here in Scotland at Maeshowe, and maybe some will admit to it. But then they'll say, well, no, they weren't really in any strong level of contact with the people in Carnac, that these are completely separate, you know. Now, let's do a comparison of those. So we have Newgrange and we have Gavrinis. And what do we have? Both aligned to the solstice, winter solstice. We notice these particular forms of artwork here. And when you have a look at the different versions, you're seeing exactly the same motifs, exactly the same forms and the symbols. Now, just down the road from Newgrange is Noah, which also has this, what could be the world's oldest sundial built into there. And yeah, so it's quite clear that these are connected. Now, even now, Kercado mentioned that's almost aligned to midwinter, though there was a grave there found 4,500 BC, so 6,500 years ago, if you include the precession of the equinoxes. Is this one so old that the alignment now has moved because of the movements of the Earth, or something that's happened in between that time? Remember, the universe is a dynamic place. The recent earthquake, not so recent, but going, was it 10 years ago now in Japan, actually shifted the wobble of the Earth. Not only moved the whole continent, a whole island chain of Japan a few feet closer to China, it also shifted the Earth. And so, accumulated over time, these sorts of events can, you know, change. The Earth is not some, just like the climate is not some static thing that's been around since, you know, Adam and Eve, you know, walked out of Eden, and then it's just been locked there in time. The climate is always changing. The planet is changing. We live in a very dynamic universe. In a human lifetime, it might not be easily noticeable, but over time, over geological time, things change in a big way. which might explain also those sunken stone circle at Lannic. And so there we have it. This is, it's a rectangle of stone. There's nothing to see here on its own. Maybe on its own, the 3, 4, 5, all these other features are meaningless. But as you start to, move through and the sites I've mentioned and gone into, and you just find these are the same features. These are consistently the same features, the same measurements on cultures that shouldn't be connected, that supposedly didn't have this particular knowledge because it was not, the Greeks invented everything, according to most schools. And well, no, the Greeks were the Greeks were brilliant. They did awesome friggin' work, not an ounce of stuff away from them. But even in their own, they went to Egypt. They moved and travelled around, and people from India travelled there as well. So there was an exchange of knowledge, and this is part of an inherited tradition which goes back cross time, cross cultures, across the world. Mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. It's the Quadrivium, it's the basics, still, weights and measures, still the basic foundation of our current sciences. It was no different back then. It's still the weights and measures, still the basic of our trade and our law systems. It was no different back then. It's literally written into the old text, the Book of the Dead, Code of Hammurabi, or countless others, even, in the Bible, for instance. And you just got to follow the chain, follow the patterns. If you want to believe in coincidence, well, that's a religion, if you want to put it that way. And just the evidence keeps mounting up, and it's all there. It's not just in one side, it's in many, and it's always coming back around to the same thing. And so with that, I hope you enjoyed. Have a good one. Again, there'll be a lot more to come. I'm going to be focusing in the next few episodes around this area in Carnac, and then connecting it again to all these other sites that I've mentioned before as ones that I haven't gone into in any detail yet. So, yep, have a good one, and please share, like, and enjoy, and cheers.